All eyes are focused on U.S. President Donald Trump's meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin next week in Alaska for Ukraine peace talks. But Trump's claim of an economic windfall from higher tariff collections ahead of that meeting seems to be playing another narrative. Trump's tariff rhetoric at the moment is just that, a rhetoric. The U.S. is facing its worst ever debt crisis, with the total debt breaching $37 trillion for the first time. The total U.S. debt has surged by $780 billion since Trump's administration raised the debt ceiling after the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was signed into law on July 4th. This amounts to a staggering $22 billion every day on average. Just last week, the government auctioned $724 billion worth of treasuries. 3 of those auctions saw tepid demand, with investors asking for higher yield. That reflects the risk of the U.S. debt crisis. This comes when Trump has raised average U.S. tariffs to above 20% from about 2% before he took office in January. Interestingly, the U.S. attempts to force Russia's hands through sanctions on Moscow's oil has not really materialized as planned. When hostilities between Russia and Ukraine broke out in 2022, the U.S. and its allies had hoped that the Russian economy dependent on oil and gas exports would collapse and the conflict would end. Oil and energy revenues make up 20% of the Russian economy, with exports to Europe marking the biggest share. However, the impact from the US and European allies' policies to end Russia's so-called war machinery has been limited at best. The Russian economy has hummed along nicely since the war, despite the few temporary blips to the economy. All that the sanctions have done is redraw Moscow's trading ties and bring the BRICS nations closer. India, China have stood their ground on Russian purchases despite Trump's high tariffs threat. At the same time, the U.S. economy too was hummed or has hummed along strongly. But the boost to the economy is coming from huge debt and not strong fundamentals. That is reflected in the record surge in U.S. debt and investors' tepid demand for treasuries at auctions in recent weeks. We spoke to experts from all BRICS nations to get a sense of how they are preparing for Trump's tariffs, and this is what they told us.
It's not easy, as I just mentioned, and especially because the United States has a long history of favoring bilateral agreements, and that's exactly what President Trump is doing now, acting very strongly and promising to deal with each country individually. So it would be interesting to see if the countries in the BRICS could rise up to the challenge and act in a little more concerted effort. Doesn't mean they're going to necessarily only act together, that no longer they're going to be pursuing conversations individually with the United States, but that perhaps they could, have a little more of a unified front, to deal with these challenges from the United States. And this is a little bit what President Lula in Brazil has been trying to do. His government has signaled that he wants to continue to have dialogue with the United States. There are important people from the Brazilian government in the last few weeks in Washington negotiating exemptions from some of the tariffs. But also President Lula has signaled that this will not take place, and the willingness of Brazil to negotiate with the United States is not going to be at the cost of Brazilian sovereignty, because the decision from the United States about Brazil has a very strong political motivation as well, which we can talk if you want. So Brazil has at the same time working with the United States, but also signaling that he wants also to see take the opportunity to have a concerted effort with the BRICS nations and other countries in the South.
Yes, I think that the American position is quite ambivalent here, as they're trying to press all the countries which have, by the opinion of American president, so-called imbalanced trade with the United States, as United States actually could not earn more from trade with China or India, for instance. That is why Washington tries to press using some economic arguments. And of course, there are also some political arguments, and India and China are not in the American camp, in the Western camp, even not supporting Russia directly. India is cooperating very extensively and very significantly, which is rather unpleasant for the United States, who is trying to control all the dynamic of the foreign trade.
we have a very singularly bad incident of tariffs affecting that relationship at this point in time. But nothing is lost. We are going to still discuss in the last week of August. A US delegation is coming to discuss the trade issues further, and we will be in a position to get something out of it. And I strongly believe that once the Ukraine-Russia war is over, I'm sure US is going to look into Russia through a different lens, and that will be the time when all these, Russian tariffs will go away. And meanwhile, we'll have to keep our head cool. We'll have to negotiate, taking into account our red lines, and see that, if there is necessity to offer a market with an accelerated tariff reduction, we should be in a position to do so. But take care of the red lines very, very clearly. Those are the areas where we will be never in a position to give up our interests.
Well, push is the word, because these three countries are not so much attracted together as being pushed together, because there is continuing rivalry for influence between India and China, not to mention the border disputes. There is also not 100% alignment of interest between Russia and China. But on the other hand, all three countries are suffering from Donald Trump's no-holds-bar tariffs and other sanctions and restrictions. So these Trump is trying to invoke the rules of the jungle in place of the so-called rule-based order.
I think Mr. Trump's actions are risky in the longer term for the US's diplomatic relations with the rest of the world, and then the BRICS nations and the global South. If anything, these declarations, these announcements, these measures, if they come into play, will only serve to, as you hinted at earlier, unite them, bring them closer together in a distrust of the global North, a criticism of the West, sort of proving some of the suspicions that there had been in the past, that in the end, you make declarations about democracy and fairness, but you actually only in it for yourself.